not to respond with the real Japan. Mr. Speaker, I agree with those who are bringing or entertaining the arguments that countries borrow. And they said Japan. Actually, the actual Japan debt to GDP ratio is around 237%, which I agree is beyond the 100% of Kenya. But Mr. Speaker, that is so pedestrian, because there are issues that we must look at very closely when we are talking about the issue of public debt. Number one is cost. Japan, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government is paid to borrow. What do I mean? The 10-year yield of a Japanese bond, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government bond, is actually negative earning, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, the government of Japan is actually paid to borrow. The same equivalent, the 10-year bond of the government of Kenya, is in excess of 13%. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, there is actually nothing to compare. Number two, there is something called forex. Most of our debt that is foreign is dollar denominated. Mr. Speaker, our country has got over 5 trillion of foreign debt. Anytime there is a variation of only 1% of dollar to Kenya shilling, Mr. Speaker, our debt portfolio increases by over 50 billion. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we cannot compare Kenya and Japan or even with the US. But more importantly, there is something called net borrowing. When we talk about national public debt, we actually take the figure of the monies that the government has borrowed. In retrospect, Mr. Speaker, our country, Kenya, lends to no one. We only borrow. And I'm actually using the same site of Japan. The Japanese government, yes, they have borrowed in excess of 237%. But, Mr. Speaker, they have lent more money outside than they have borrowed. Actually, Japan is the highest net lender to the US government. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese government actually makes money in borrowing to lend. And therefore, there is no comparison also there. Mr. Speaker,